July 9th, 1967, at the Soviet Air Force Day Parade in Domodedovo, 4 massive jets thunder over the reviewing stands sleek, silver, and impossibly fast. The announcer declares 3,000 kilometers an hour. Mach 2. Fuck yeah. But the reality, these new MiG-25 Foxbats were already pushing past Mach 3. In Washington, alarm bells rang. Congress was warned. We have no fighter in our inventory that could combat the Foxbat. For the first time since Korea, America feared it had lost control of the skies. But was this mysterious Soviet machine truly the super fighter the world believed, or something else entirely? The shock of the MiG-25's debut wasn't the first time America had been rattled by Soviet air power. 2 decades earlier, in the skies over Korea, the U.S. Air Force had learned a brutal lesson. There, the nimble Soviet-built MiG-15 had gone head-to-head with the F-86 Sabre. Dogfights were raw, personal, and often decided by who could yank their stick harder, climb steeper, or outturn the other man at the last second. It was the age of the gunslinger close-range aerial duels where reflexes and nerve meant survival. But by the mid-1950s, that world was already fading. New radar systems promised to detect enemies long before a pilot could even see them. Guided missiles, fresh out of the labs, promised to kill from miles away. Pentagon planners became convinced the future of air combat was not face-to-face dogfights, but beyond visual range anonymous blips on a radar screen, destroyed before they ever came close. That thinking gave birth to the F-4 Phantom. Unlike the lightsabers and nimble Korean warfighters, the Phantom was a brute, heavy, packed with electronics, bristling with missiles. It had speed, it had radar, it had firepower at range. What it didn't have was a gun, because in the minds of its designers, cannons were obsolete. Then came Vietnam. The skies over Southeast Asia were chaos, hundreds of aircraft, friendly and hostile, often tangled in the same patch of air. Identification systems failed, forcing pilots to close in, eyeball the target, and confirm before firing. Suddenly, those high-tech, long-range killers were being dragged into knife fights, and the Phantom was hopelessly out of its depth. Its missiles, designed for lumbering bombers, barely worked against agile fighters. Early hit rates, 14%. That meant 7 out of 8 shots missed completely. And when the missiles failed, Phantom pilots had nothing left. No gun, no backup. Just a smoky trail from engines that made them easy prey. Across the jungle skies, small Soviet-built MiG-17s and MiG-21s tore into the heavier Phantoms, exploiting every weakness, turning inside them. Forcing close-range duels the F-4 couldn't win. American pilots were being outmaneuvered and outgunned. The U.S. had built an interceptor and tried to pass it off as a dogfighter, and young airmen were paying the price. In desperation, the Air Force bolted Gatling gun pods onto Phantoms and rushed pilots through crash courses in dogfighting. Kill ratios improved, but only barely. Everyone knew these were band-aids on a broken design. What America needed wasn't a patched-up Phantom. It needed something completely new, a fighter built from the ground up for one purpose: to seize and hold absolute control of the skies. And when the Soviets unveiled the MiG-25, the pressure to build that fighter, the true air superiority jet, became impossible to ignore. July 9th, 1967, at the Soviet Air Force Day Parade in Domodedovo, 4 MiG-25s roared past the grandstands. The announcer proudly declared a new fighter capable of speeds near 3,000 kilometers per hour. Mach 2, faint, maybe even higher. To Western eyes, this was no ordinary airplane. It was a monster, a supposed superfighter that could outrun, outclimb, and outgun anything the U.S. had in the skies. Intelligence reports described it as a threat with no equal. Thus began the Foxbat panics. But behind the curtain of Soviet propaganda, the truth was far less glorious. The MiG-25's development was written in blood. In 1967, test pilot Igor Lesnikov died in a fiery crash. 2 years later, even General Karamtsev, the commander of Soviet air defense aviation, was killed when his Foxbat's engine overheated. 4 more pilots would follow. The reasons were consistent: engines that ran too hot, a nickel-steel frame so heavy it crippled agility, and flight characteristics so unpredictable that even theory couldn't guarantee survival. Yet the Soviets doubled down on the myth. They rolled out a series of world records for speed and altitude, parading the Foxbat as if it were a Mach 3 killer, a machine that could dominate the stratosphere. In Washington, those numbers set off alarm bells. The U.S. already had a program on the books, Project FX, launched in 1965. It was meant to explore the next generation of fighters, but after 1967, it shifted into overdrive. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Air Force Colonel John Boyd and analyst Thomas Christie introduced a new way of thinking: energy maneuverability theory, a mathematical formula for speed, thrust, drag, and weight, but in practice. A revolution in fighter doctrine. A real fighter, they argued, had to hold its energy, stay fast, stay nimble, and fight at every altitude. In 1969, McDonnell Douglas won the contract. From that moment, the Eagle was born. The F-15 was built from the ground up for one mission: air superiority. 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines produced 48,000 pounds of thrust enough power to go supersonic while climbing straight up. With a top speed over Mach 2, Finks, it rivaled the Foxbat's raw speed. But unlike the MiG, it kept its agility. Its broad wings gave it low wing loading, and combined with its near 1 thrust-to-weight ratio, the Eagle could turn hard, accelerate out of danger, and still fight in a dogfight. The cockpit was elevated, framed by a bubble canopy for a 360-degree view. A digital heads-up display tied radar and avionics together, letting the pilot fight without ever looking down. 8 missiles, Sparrows and Sidewinders lined the fuselage and wings, while a 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon spat 6,000 rounds per minute. Unlike the Phantom in Vietnam, the Eagle would never enter combat without a gun. In 1975, America decided to tear off the Foxbat's mask, a stripped-down F-15 bare metal. No paint took off from North Dakota's cold, dense airfields. In a series of climbs, it shattered every time-to-altitude record the MiG-25 once held by more than 25%. The message to Moscow was unmistakable. The game had changed. The F-15 wasn't just a reply to the MiG-25. It was the proof that the U.S. had absorbed the painful lessons of Vietnam. From now on, the skies would belong to the Eagle. September 6th, 1976, a single MiG-25 streaked across the skies of Japan. At the controls was Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, a young Soviet pilot who had decided to risk everything. His Foxbat thundered into Hakodate Airport so fast, so heavy, that he nearly collided with a civilian airliner on approach. He slammed onto the runway, skidding dangerously close to disaster. But he had made it. The Cold War had just delivered America its greatest intelligence windfall. Over the next several weeks, engineers tore Belenko's jet apart bolt by bolt. What they found shocked them, not because the MiG-25 was advanced, but because it wasn't. The so-called titanium wonder was built mostly of nickel steel, a crude but cheap solution. Its massive R-15 engines could reach Mach 3, but only for a few minutes any longer. and they would literally destroy themselves. The radar was powered by vacuum tubes, decades behind you. Say, avionics. Its enormous wings weren't for agility. They were just there to lift the beast off the ground. On paper, the MiG-25 could only manage 5Gs, a death sentence in a dogfight. Its combat radius was barely 300 kilometers, less than a third of what American planners feared. What the world thought was a dogfighting monster turned out to be what the Soviets had always intended. A blunt, high-speed interceptor. A bomber killer. Nothing more. For the U.S., it was vindication. The panic that gave birth to the F-15 had been based on a myth. But now, America had something more than reassurance. It had the best fighter in the world. The Eagle soon got the chance to prove it. In 1979, Israeli F-15s intercepted a formation of Syrian MiG-21s. In a matter of minutes, 4 enemy jets were downed without a single Israeli loss. It was the first of many. Through the 1980s, the Eagle became a legend. More than 100 confirmed air-to-air victories, and not a single loss in aerial combat. No other fighter in history has matched that record. Yes, some F-15s were lost, brought down by surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft fire, or accidents. But in the pure duel of jet versus jet, the Eagle reigned undefeated. The design only improved. The F-15C and D extended range and weapon loadouts, while the F-15E Strike Eagle transformed the air superiority fighter into a deep strike powerhouse capable of precision bombing at night, in any weather, while still holding its crown in the air-to-air arena. Then came the ultimate test. The Gulf War of 1991. F-15s swept the skies over Iraq, destroying MiG-29s, MiG-25s, and Su-22s. For the Iraqis, the matchups were hopeless. Eagles picked them apart with radar-guided missiles before they even knew they were under attack. The Eagle dominated the battlefield, proving beyond doubt it was the finest fighter of its generation. And yet there was one reminder that the Foxbat, even in its flawed form, still had teeth. On the opening night of the war, an Iraqi MiG-25 managed to ambush and shoot down a Navy FA-18 Hornet. It was the only American jet lost to enemy aircraft in the entire conflict. Proof that in the right conditions, even a relic could be deadly. But by then, the message was already clear. The MiG-25 was a blunt weapon. The F-15 was a masterpiece. The Soviets had tried to terrify the world with the Foxbat, but it was the Eagle that changed the balance of power in the skies. And in January 1991, as MiG-25s and F-15s met head-to-head over Baghdad, the Cold War rivalry reached its climax. But that story, that dogfight, belongs to another chapter. The story of the MiG-25 and the F-15 isn't just about two machines. It's about how fear, perception, and propaganda can shape history. The Foxbat terrified the West into building the Eagle, and in doing so, the Soviets accidentally pushed America to create the greatest air superiority fighter of its time. The F-15 didn't just match the myth of the MiG-25, it shattered it, rewriting the balance of power in the skies. But the Cold War wasn't finished with it yet, because when the Foxbat and the Eagle finally clashed over Baghdad in 1991, the outcome wasn't what anyone predicted.